Good morning, good afternoon, good evening on your screen in our show. Hello, welcome everyone. Today we are honored to have David Raab, the founder of the Customer Data Platform Institute, joining us again. After some while, we are happy that we have him again in our show. David is a widely recognized expert in marketing technology and analytics with a career spanning over 3 decades. That's quite a time. Since 1987, he has been an independent consultant specializing in marketing trends, technology, strategy, product requirements, and vendor selection. As a founder of the CDP Institute, David has been instrumental in helping companies manage customer data effectively and leverage it for business growth. His insights and expertise are invaluable, and we are excited to hear more from him on that today. Please join me and welcome David. Hello, David. What did I forget in the introduction?
Well, I wish it were only 3 decades, but it was very generous of you to make me feel a little younger. That was a great introduction. Thank you, Alfred. Great to be here. Great to see you.
The pleasure is ours, and trust me, with 39 years on my shoulders, I'm always jumping around. Do I talk about 40 years in the business or 30 plus?
How about talking about retirement?
No, we don't.
That is also something we have from time to time with our dear friend Michael Wu, who is also on this planet for some time and very knowledgeable. But that is exactly what is one of these challenges. CDPs have a lot of data inside, such as human brains, and hopefully some wisdom is created out of this. So what is changing in the definition of the CDP as you have created the 187, if I'm not mistaken, by yourself? And how did the role of the CDP change a bit over time? And I'm very curious because data cleaning is always my hobby, and I'm always hammering on shitty data. So is there any cure for the malady of the incorrect data? So starting with that, David.
Well, that's a lot of questions there.
It's covering the hour.
Yeah. So CDP, the definition was 2013 is when I did coin the term. The definition at the original time was an application that created its own customer database. Since before then, and we're all old enough to remember, we had custom databases, and then we had applications like campaign management systems or predictive modeling systems that would attach to a custom database. What I saw in 2013 was a number of applications that were creating their own database, so they did not need to attach to a separate customer database that was custom built. We used to call those customer data warehouses and such. That was different. That was new, so it needed a new name, and Customer Data Platform was a good name for that. The letters CDP were available. No one else was using that particular acronym because, you know, that's very important. So CDP it was. Very soon after the original definition, I changed it because what we noticed was that what was really important was building the database, not so much the campaign management application or the predictive modeling application or the customer support application. So the definition became not an application that built its own database, but a system that built a database, not for some other purpose, but available for any other purpose. So what it did was replace those custom-built customer data warehouses with an application-built customer data warehouse. And that definition really has not changed since then, at least in my world. If you go and look at the CDP Institute definition, it is a persistent system that builds a customer database. So basically CDPs build profiles is the shorthand for that. What's happened in the rest of the world is they attached additional meanings to CDP. So if you look at what most people talk about with the CDP, they really do two things. First of all, they don't necessarily require the CDP to take data from all other sources, which is part of our definition, our requirements. We don't consider you a real CDP unless you actually can take data from any source and keep it indefinitely. So sometimes people think, well, as long as I have my customer data in it, it's a CDP, whether or not it gets data from other sources or not. The second thing that's happened is that people have said, well, the CDP must do more than simply assemble a database. The CDP has to activate the data. So many people say, well, the CDP should do orchestration. The CDP should do multi-channel message delivery. The CDP should do segmentation. Or a CDP should have predictive modeling built in, all of which are things that many CDPs do. And in fact, the majority of CDPs have those kinds of delivery capabilities or campaign management capabilities. But to us, that's not part of the core definition. And we get to an interesting discussion where well, CDPs do all these other things, and that's too much, and that's a bad thing. And say, well, that's not what makes it a CDP, at least in my particular view of the world. So the rest of the world has kind of expanded and perhaps diluted the definition of CDP, but we've actually kept it very, very specific.
Interesting movement. Yeah.
Is it a fair statement that the need for a CDP kind of concept arose from, well, that cloud is at fault, to put it quote unquote, because before we had suites of applications that had a consolidated database. And then came this trend of, well, why paying for everything, this broad functionality of which I probably only need 10%. So I wanted silo. And with silos, well, the mandatory consequence is that you have several databases that start to become inconsistent. So is it a fair statement to say that cloud is at fault?
Well, the original impetus of the CDP, again, was that people had to build custom databases, and many companies simply weren't able to build those custom databases. Okay, more recently, what we've seen, which I think you may be referring to, is companies building large cloud data warehouses, basically, and people saying, well, okay, I have this big cloud data warehouse in Snowflake or BigQuery or whatever system I'm using for that. So I've already assembled all this data there, so why do I need a separate CDP system to assemble all the data? And that's where we get into the composability and such, which I think is where you're headed with that question. That's a much more recent development. And again, if you think back historically, CDPs wouldn't exist if companies had been able to build their own customer databases. The reason the CDP existed was the marketing department went to IT and said, hey, I need all this data. And the IT department said, hey, we can't do that. Or they said, yeah, we can do that. And then 3 years later, they still hadn't done it. Yeah. Today, the data is a little more available. So it's somewhat more realistic to expect that.
No, I actually was looking, sorry, no, I'm getting a cough as well. I was actually looking at the history side, because yes, the IT department said, well, I can't do that, or it takes a lot of time, but wasn't the root cause for that the fragmentation of systems, probably even combined with local decision and purchasing power that created shadow IT without an end, which then caused exactly the problem for which now I yank your chain, the CDP is a band-aid for.
Yeah, I think there certainly was a proliferation of systems over the past, say, 20 years, which made it more obvious and more pressing that the data was fragmented. So there was a greater need to pull it together. Again, historically, even before that, you had, even if you had one data source, if that data source wasn't accessible to marketing, which it often wasn't because it was transactional data, customer purchase history, CRM data, which predates CDP, marketing couldn't get its hands on it. So the CDP was really originally more of a tool for marketing to access the customer data. Now, as additional channels came on board, in particular, web channels came on, So you had now just not one major data source, but 2 or 3 major data sources of interaction data. Then the problem became more acute, and the CDP became a much more important solution to that problem. In fact, many of the original CDPs started out as website tag managers. They were pulling in web data, which was otherwise not available, and even today is not available in many corporate data warehouses. Simply not, because traditionally data warehouses have held financial data. They were really usually built for financial analysis and business analysis. So the web data was unstructured or semi-structured, hard data to fit into a traditional data warehouse. So that was one of the specific reasons. And then as additional channels and additional systems came on board, the problem became even more pressing, and the need for the CDP became even more obvious.
So, other sources or systems that became CDPs started in the CM arena, so customer identity and access management. So since when has that become important, especially outside of Europe, where, well, consenting always was a kind of a topic, more than here in the US?
Well, privacy is much more stringently respected in Europe than in the US. Interestingly, the CIM guys, they're a different world, and the other system, master data management systems, which also kind of overlap a little, the CIAM, those are more IT tools, and we don't see too many of the CDP vendors having originated there. I think SAP, was kind of the exception.
They incited that,
Yeah, but that's really the only one I can think of. Otherwise, they've remained a little different. They are sort of all converging, because technically they're quite similar. Now, interestingly, at least perhaps, I have always said identity management, identity resolution were not a core CDP requirement, which is kind of paradoxical, because you need to do that to build unified profiles, right? CDPs build profiles. Again, that's what they do. You can't do that without identity resolution. The reason that I kept it outside of my list of things CDPs must be able to do is that there are so many third-party systems like CIM, like master data management, specialized tools, the big customer databases from people like Experian, that actually did a better job because they'd had more access to data than what any company would have on its own. So just as a purely sort of empirical thing, we looked at the systems that were CDPs, and many of them simply didn't have that. We said, well, okay, if half the vendors don't have it, we can't really make it a requirement, because that would then make the market smaller than it really is. So we said it's okay to use a third-party tool to do the identity management. You have to do it. There's no question that you can't unify customer data unless you can identify all the different identifiers that relate to the same person and bring them together to build an identity graph, which is not what we called it 20 years ago, but now we call it an identity graph. So you have to have that capability, but you can go out to a third party and get that. And that's okay from a CDP standpoint. So maybe half the CDP vendors today have their own identity management tools. It's very important. And I think it's become more common. But it's also a very, very difficult thing to do well. Okay, not so much the CIM stuff, because CIM, you're pretty much assuming that you're told what identities belong to the same person. This is my account, and these are my emails, and these are my sign-ins, and these are my rights. That's, you don't have to guess, okay? A lot of other identity management comes in looking and say, well, is this email address and this device really the same person or not? And I can go and look deterministically to see if this account is logged in with that device, then okay, yeah, they're part of it. Or I can do a probabilistically, say, well, this device and that device seem to kind of show up the same place at the same time. They travel together. They kind of do similar things. They're probably the same person. Or we look even probabilistically at the similarity of, this address and that address. Yeah, they're not identical, but they're similar. The master data management systems are really good at that kind of thing.
There is an interesting question that I like to bring in a second, but as a lead into that, so as from my perception, and you're the right guy to tell me that I'm wrong, is that CDPs in general developed with a B2C background. So that there are, I can think of 3, I think, that do B2B, maybe a bit more meanwhile, but there is the question, so is there a history in B2B account-based CDPs? And some learnings that you can share that those businesses or those vendors basically needed to undergo?
Well, you're right that most of them were B2C and some of them are B2B. So there is a separate category of B2B, and yeah, there's maybe 4 or 5. I can't even lift them off the top of my head, but and they came out more from that marketing automation world. Okay. So now there are structural differences, right? Accounts in particular, B2B systems have accounts and B2C systems don't. So your identity graph looks a little more complicated. Your data structure looks a little more complicated, which is why they're a separate class of CDP. The problem was the same. You still need unified data. And if anything, the problem was even more acute. The difference from a sort of business standpoint was that CRM systems are much more developed. So many B2B marketers use their CRM as their CDP, where they think they're the same thing. Of course, they're not, but they rely on that because most of their customer data sits in the CRM. Whereas in the B2C world, the customer data is a little more scattered. We have some web data over here. We have some email data over there. We have some purchase history in this system. We have retail store, point of sale sort of systems over here. We have a lot of different systems that are all collecting data. So it's much more obvious that it's got to be pulled together. Whereas in B2B, most of that data ends up in the CRM, with some prominent exceptions like purchase history, not necessarily in the CRM. So it was just a little slower to see that there's a need for a separate system in the B2B world.
What would prevent someone from using the CRM system? In my definition of a CRM system, it comprises of sales, service, and marketing. What would prevent a company using the CRM database as the activation system as well? Means the CDP?
Well, the problem was, at least historically, the CRM systems were not very good at importing data from other sources. They generated most of their data by themselves. They were all about really customer interactions and recording those customer interactions and putting it in the database. And that might be a salesperson's interaction or a service person's interaction. And then, marketing automation, which was handling your marketing interactions, was really separate. Okay. So, and the data structures were quite rigid, again, originally in the CRM system. So to add a new data source or even a new table was often impossible. Now, the more powerful systems, the enterprise level systems, did eventually add custom objects, which at least theoretically allowed you to add in those other data sources and support them. But because they weren't designed for mass activity to analyze bulk sets of data, they were designed really for those one-to-one interactions where there's a screen and a person talking to another person. They weren't built from an architectural standpoint to do the things that you want to do, which is why marketing automation systems exist. Marketing automation systems did have that kind of an analytical data structure. So now CRM systems, at least again, the big ones, have kind of recognized that and adapted it. So it's more possible today to use a CRM system to do what a CDP does, because they are a little better at importing data and at analyzing large masses of data and then at making that data accessible. The other thing was that traditionally the CRM systems didn't really make their data available to external systems. And again, part of that CDP definition is they share the data with other systems. That's what a CDP is built for. So there were a number of key flaws in the CRM system that prevented it from doing what you really want a CDP to do. Those flaws have been, at least in some of the better systems, removed. So now it's more plausible. But even if you look at Salesforce. Okay, we'll just come out and say it. Who we're talking about here? They have the data cloud underneath now, underneath the sales cloud and the service cloud, and even the marketing cloud. So even they have said, we have a separate database that is much more powerful, more flexible, and has more information in it than we need just for a traditional CRM for a sales or a service module, which is kind of a backwards recognition that the original architecture simply wasn't adequate.
And it's probably quite hard to just move out one database and exchange it with the other one, which then would be the data cloud. So
Salesforce has been struggling with that for quite a few years. They made quite a few efforts. I think they finally have kind of gotten it right, but they're still working on it. I think it's still a work in progress to migrate everything over to data cloud.
Which also in my eyes makes perfect sense. So you might not use the whole data model, but having a common data model below all sorts of applications is something that in my book counts as good. And
it is good. But if you're a big ship like Salesforce, it takes a long time to turn around. You're not really a ship; you're more of a fleet, and you have to. The fleet has to turn at the same time
with all those acquisitions. But you already alluded to data clouds, and Salesforce is not the only one. So, and if I look back in, let's say from 2015 or let's say 16, yes, CRM systems improved a lot in terms of their ability to ingest. We have a whole raft of BI systems that, they're designed to ingest and activate to quite an extent, whether the objective of the activation is the same one as in a CDP or not, maybe subject to discussion. Then we have all those data warehouses, lake houses. We even have marketing clouds that have considerable CDP functionality inside to quite an extent. So that to me indicates that there is then let's add AI. There is a big convolution going on, or a conversion going on that makes separate entities into potentially a bigger one, a more powerful one. How do you see that market developed? Does it collapse into something like a black hole, into something that is more powerful and more encompassing than CDP? So that, let's call it common data platform instead of customer data platform.
Well, there's definitely a potential for that, and perhaps even a realization of that. Our definition of CDP has, I think, 6 elements. I'll see if I can remember them now. All right, so a CDP has to be able to accept data from all sources. It has to be able to keep all the detail, not throw any of it away. It has to retain it indefinitely, not just throw it away after 30 or 60 or 90 days, like many of the DMPs used to do. It has to unify the data to build the profiles. And again, we don't say you have to have identity management, but you have to have access to something that does identity management. And then it has to share that data with any other system. And then it has to have certain real-time capabilities like event trigger and API access to individual customer data. So those are 6 things. 7 if you split the real-time into 2. All right. So many of the systems that are predictive modeling systems or campaign management systems or even CRM systems do meet those definitions today. They didn't used to, but many of them have opened up to more data sources. They have, on the other side of it, made their profiles available to external systems, which is the other place that many of those systems traditionally have fallen short. So if you do all those things, we consider you a CDP. And again, when I look at the CDP marketplace, we find, I think it's close to 200 now, I've lost count, systems that do that, but 75% of those systems are really something that's built for campaign management or for delivery, or really for some true application, some sort of activation functionality. And they've done what you just said, they've added in a CDP capability. And so long as they meet those requirements that I just listed, I consider it a CDP. So the market's getting bigger from my perspective, although it's converging perhaps from another perspective. Now, does that continue to grow, and do we end up with one system that does everything. It's got all the customer data. It has all the CRM functionality, the marketing automation functionality, the customer support functionality, and oh, by the way, perhaps the merchandising functionality and some of the other operational logistics functionalities possible. I mean, again, to some extent, it's already happened because we have all those activation systems that qualify as CDPs. The interesting question about the common data platform is it no longer just customer data? Do we have to have product data in there? Do we have to have location data? Do we have to have site data if you're a retailer, for example? Do we have to have other kinds of data, content for marketing that really is not customer data? One of the limitations of the original CDP designs, and again, many still of the CDPs that were built as CDPs, was they would only accept data if it had a customer ID attached. That's a very common data model. You had a customer profile and you had events. And the event could be anything. It could be a website visit. It could be an email being sent. It could be a purchase. So that's great. And that's a very flexible data model. But there's no place to put products in there. You can't have a product table because the products are not themselves attached to customers. Purchases are. So again, as with the CRM systems, adding custom objects, many of the more advanced CRM CDP vendors have expanded their data models. Now, it's the same problem the CRM guys had. If you built the system optimized to do one thing, and then you change your data model because you want to add this other stuff in, then a lot of your optimizations aren't any good anymore. So you have to re-engineer your system to accommodate this new data structure. And that's a tricky thing. And it's a lot of investment involved to do it right if you had a good system to begin with. Okay, if you really had a good custom system, if you were used some generic relational database, easy enough to add, but then you're going to have scalability and performance issues because you really had to do some customization to make those things work well to begin with. But yeah, there's definitely a major movement towards adding those other kinds of data. That's where now you say, okay, well, that's what's in my data warehouse. My data warehouse has all this stuff. It connects it more or less, to varying degrees of ease and efficiency, but it's all in there. So why do I need a separate CDP if all this data is in my data warehouse and the data warehouse technology has gotten good enough that I can get reasonable performance for most of my requirements out of that cloud data, typically a cloud data warehouse, but any big database, modern database with a data warehouse can kind of sort of do this stuff. Where we run into problems with that, trying to use a cloud data warehouse for a CDP is the real-time stuff. Okay, because the big cloud databases, they're not built for real time. So you have to either not do it at all or kind of play some tricks, add some new data structures that are optimized for real time to make that work. So that's the one of the few areas where the CDP still has a bit of an advantage, at least some of the CDPs do. Again, my definition of CDP, you have to have those real-time capabilities. Some of the vendors that we call a CDP, their real-time capabilities are possibly not what you would want them to be. We're kind of generous in how we assess that. But at least it should be there. And if you're really going to use it seriously, you have to really make sure that it can meet your real-time requirements. And real-time is really important.
Yeah. How do you define real time? Because I mean, it can be only as real time as the ingestion happens, and if that happens in batches, then well, let's call it near time then.
Absolutely. So again, we are very specific. So we say you have to be able to do real time event triggering. So drop shopping cart is the classic example, right? So I'm getting that's a website data feed. It's a real time data feed, to your point. And I want to react to that in real time. That doesn't mean the data is going to be actually posted to the CDP database in real time. It just means it has to monitor that event stream and allow you to set up a trigger that does something with that data. Okay, because adding that data to the database itself is often a lot of processing and may or may not happen in true real time, as you said. The second real time thing that we require is real time access, typically through an API, to the profiles as they exist. Even if the profiles are not updated in real time, I want my personalization system or my customer service system to be able to call out, look up this customer, find everything that we have about them in their current profile as it stands, pull it back in and then use it for, again, personalization or whatever. Now, if there's a lag because there's a real batch data feed, okay, that data is not going to be in there. That's kind of beyond the capability of the CDP, or if, as I say, even though the data stream may be real time, if the CDP doesn't update itself, its core data stored in real time, that's okay. That's another set of real-time requirements. Some CDPs do true real-time updates of the core data store of the profiles. Most do not, because that again, is very tricky to do that well. You need some special technology to really make that happen. But you can do most of what you want to do with a CDP without that. Our definition is really kind of backwards engineered from what we think people want to do with a CDP. We think people want to use the CDP to manage those personalized interactions, to do that real-time analysis, to do stuff like that. So you say, okay, for people to get what they want, what they expect the CDP to do, what are the requirements that the CDP has to be able to perform to deliver on that? And that's where we get into, I won't say problems, but that's where we get a little annoyed. People will take a system that doesn't meet our requirement, doesn't meet my definition of a CDP, and then they'll try to do something that they think a CDP should do, and it doesn't do it because their system doesn't meet the definition. They say, oh, CDP is bad. It's like, well, no, you don't really have a CDP. You have something that claims to be a CDP or that you think is a CDP, but it doesn't meet the definition. So it's not surprising that it doesn't do what a CDP is supposed to do. It's not not the fault of the concept, it's the fault of the system.
If it's a real CDP or a mock-up type CDP, to say so, I just was wondering how clean data is mandatory. And the second part is, how does a real-time driven CDP support the AI expectations towards a mock-up CDP or another database?
Okay, well, obviously two questions. Certainly clean data is important. And to some extent, the CDP can do some data cleaning. But, really, if the data is bad to begin with, there's not that much you can do. If you capture the wrong customer identifier, or if your product descriptions are inconsistent, you can't really hope. There's not too much the CDP itself can do with that. So you have to go back to your source systems, or even worse, if simply the data is not available, or it's a batch feed, and you really needed a real-time feed. That's something that limits what the CDP can do. So you do have to go back to your source systems and have good data governance and good data cleaning and all the things that, as we said earlier, we've been talking about for decades, and people will talk about for decades to come. Maybe the AIs will be talking about it, and they'll be sort of, complaining, oh, these damn humans, they can't get their data entry straight. And they'll just take it over from us, but that's okay. I'll be retired. To your second point about what AI needs, certainly AI needs clean data. Okay, just as any application or activation needs clean data. If anything, the AI needs it even more. Because it's going to do more with it. If the AI is really going to, create personalized content on the fly, first of all, that real time becomes important, right? Because it wants to have the most current data. And secondly, the clean data becomes important because you want to have the unified profile that really gives you the full context of the individual, so you can make sure that the information that the AI is working from is complete and accurate. So the classic example that we all worry about pre-AI and post-AI is, I go off and I'm buying a gift for my daughter-in-law, and I'm looking at whatever it is she might like. I have no idea what my daughter-in-law would like, but let's say she wants a doll. Okay, maybe it's a granddaughter. And so I'm looking at dolls. Well, I'm not interested in dolls. I'm just buying a gift for someone, right? But the profile says, oh, this person's interested in dolls, and now it's going to start personalizing messages related to dolls. Well, that's not right. But if the system has my full profile, it says, wait a minute, this guy, he doesn't usually look at dolls. He usually looks at power tools. So even though yesterday he was looking at dolls, I'm just going to send him something for power tools because I know that's what he's really fascinated by. Okay, so the AI needs that complete data to make a good judgment.
Interesting.
Isn't that a challenge that was? I mean, that's their pre-AI. There we totally agree. And
nothing new about
I mean, it's pretty much the same for any activation system, which a CDP is. So the same rule applies: rubbish in, rubbish out, right? So I mean, why was why do you consider then as the quality of the activation depends on the data quality, why do you consider data quality being out of the scope of a CDP? Again, because something else can do that, like custom identity management or access?
Well, okay, so data quality and identity management, two different things, right? I mean,
Yeah. No, but I'm asking whether it's the same reason that you consider it out.
Oh,
The
yeah, well,
identity.
even more so. I mean, identity management, you could build into a CDP, and again, many CDPs do identity management. Data quality is so dependent on the source systems that you really have to put the onus there. You can't, there's just no way for the CDP to solve a data quality problem. If the data is bad, the data is bad, and you have to fix it. The CDP can't fix bad data. Nothing can fix bad data. The only way to fix bad data is to not get bad data in the first place. Okay. And
Yeah.
when you look at data quality systems, which is a class of system, right, they're all about governance and monitoring and checking the data that comes in and flagging errors and going back and say, hey, fix this error, or fix this, find the source of this error and make sure that you clean up your input processes. So that's far beyond the scope of what anyone would really ask a CDP to do.
Yeah, my question is why? Because the CDP is kind of the spider in the net.
Well,
the hub, basically, and all the other systems are at the end of some spokes. So each of these systems individually can have.
Yeah.
Oh, you're in demand. Each of these systems can have great quality data, but the combination is not. That can be solved only at the hub.
Yeah, well, all right, well, that's a good point. So, although except I'm not so sure I agree with the final point.
That's good if you're not agreeing. Discussion is good.
All right, so a system can collect data that's suitable for its purpose.
Yeah,
isn't necessarily suitable for the CDP purpose, right? So the classic example is delivery address. So if it's a logistics system that's to schedule the deliveries for my packages, it can say, third house on the left, with the white mailbox, and delivery guy will deal with that and have no problem whatsoever, right? But perfectly adequate for the purpose of getting the package delivered to my door. Not necessarily adequate for my CDP, because that data is too vague and doesn't really give exactly what I need, which is a precise address that I can then match against the postal address or some other kind of address on an account system, right? So data adequate, suitable for the original purpose, not suitable for the marketing or the CDP purpose. So that's a fundamental problem. So the only way to solve that problem is to go back to the source system and say, hey, no, you really have to put in postal addresses into your delivery system because that's what I need for my purposes. The delivery system manager may look at you and say, well, it's a lot of extra work for me. Doesn't solve my problem. I don't need it. So you may or may not get cooperation. And that's where, again, the data governance stuff comes in. Somebody has to say, no, it's got to work this way. But then to turn around and say that that's the responsibility of the CDP to solve that problem, it just isn't. So the CDP has to certainly take whatever it gets and do the best that's possible. So maybe the CDP could take that delivery system with its crazy, verbal descriptions and attach an AI to it that goes out and uses Google Maps to look at the street and find the house with the white mailbox and say, oh, that's number 179. I'll put that in the system for you. So you might ask a CDP to do that, but I would say that's kind of peripheral to the CDP. It would be something that it would be a little silly to say a CDP must do that. It's great if the CDP does it, and you certainly want some system to do it, perhaps, but that would be a lot to ask, I think, of the CDP. It's pretty far away from the core proposition of the CDP. which is to accept that data, unify it, and share it out there.
Apart from, let's say, having this abstruse and funny delivery address with third mailbox to the right, but often you have different delivery addresses. Means street address or PO boxes or whatever, and they often even define relationships between people. So send it to, well, in my case, Wolfgang Wieberneit, my dad, at the following address. Yeah. So this defines a relationship. This also defines me as potentially having some interest in that location, which then might become interesting for downstream systems as well.
Yeah.
And so there, of course, we can make it arbitrarily complicated, but the easy case would be, to me, well, there's a valid address. Might be even two different systems that have two different billing addresses, and then the CDP has two different addresses, two postal addresses, billing address of me, which needs to get cleaned.
Right.
Somehow.
And then the question is exactly as you say, how complicated do you want your data model to be? Ideally, it captures all those things, and it says not only are there two addresses associated with this identity, this person, this entity perhaps is a better term, but there's a relationship, and okay, we know that this is this is my winter home in Italy, so we know that in these months you should send to this address, and in the summer months you should send to my summer home in the Bahamas, and then of course there's my mid-season home in California. You know, I mean, I have about 8 different houses, right? I wish. Actually, I don't wish. It's horrifying.
Probably we don't wish that, but
no, only if you can have enough money to pay for the managers.
They all need to get maintained.
I don't have that anyway. But but this is my father's house, and so that's a pretty complicated thing to manage, right? I don't think most CDPs will do that. Most CDPs, if you're lucky, have a Venn graph that says, here's an entity, here's a person, and this person has these multiple addresses. And maybe if you're really lucky, it'll have a flag that says summer home or seasonal or something like that, or family member. The trick is not designing a system that can accommodate those relationships. Those systems exist. But finding a way to make that stuff kind of easily usable, right? Because I'm a marketer, and most CDPs are kind of a marketing tool. I just want to send out emails to my customers. Okay, that's all I want to do. I don't want to worry about. I don't want to have to write a query that says make sure it's you're sending to the right seasonal address, and make sure you're not sending to their parent. Blah blah. I just want to send out. So I want the system to create what's usually called a golden record that says, okay, this is the best email address for this person at this time. Or I say, you know what, I got 6 email addresses. Hell, it's only email. Send them all out. That's okay if it's email. And that's what a lot of people would do. And
that's probably what happens,
yeah, and that's okay. I mean, because it's email, right? But if it's postal mail, it's physical something that costs 50 cents or $1 or whatever a piece of mail costs these days, then I need to be a little more careful. Then I want that more powerful system. So again, ideally the CDP has the capability to do that, but you would have to look pretty hard to make sure that if that's something you really want to care about, first of all, that you can capture the information, which gets back to your source systems, and then that you can store it and capture or infer those relationships, because most of the time it's not going to tell you that. I have to figure out this is your father, and it probably will never. Maybe it'll figure out it's your father. It might just figure out that it's an associated address that's not a primary address for you. And it's probably not going to even know it's a family member, just because it could be, it could be your mistress, right? That your wife doesn't know about. I mean, who knows what you're doing? I'm not asking. I'm not implying anything.
Don't ask, don't tell. Yeah.
Exactly. If your wife is listening, no, I don't know anything you don't know. But whatever it is, all they'll know is it's an associated address.
It's a while ago, and I don't know whether this is still current, so shame on me. You had a set of different classifications of CDPs. Is that still current?
Yeah, we're very conservative. We rarely change. We rarely admit to a mistake, so we rarely change our mind.
Is that a consequence? Has that been also a consequence of the different capabilities that different CDPs have. So some things can do this and that and
Yeah,
whatnot.
and that's why we created it.
Mhm.
Again, our mission of the CDP Institute is broadly to help people do a better job managing customer data, but certainly a lot of it has to do with helping people to understand CDPs. And one of the things that we saw was this range of capabilities. All CDPs build profiles. Okay, and if that's all you do is assemble that database, in our terminology, we call you a data CDP. Some CDPs build profiles and do analytics. Okay, it's either predictive analytics or descriptive analytics, or prescriptive analytics. So if you build profiles and do analytics, we call you an analytics CDP. If you do those two things and you define marketing campaigns, okay, orchestration, we will call you a campaign CDP because you have a campaign management capability, which is to select messages, both real-time and batch messages. Some do profiles, data, campaigns, and actually deliver messages. So they send the emails. They're part of typically, they're part of the system that was designed for email delivery or postal delivery or website personalization or something. And those in our language are delivery CDP. So they do all these things. And I think there's even a fifth category called operational CDP that is part of a reservation system or something that actually used to run your business, but also has all the other capabilities. And there are a lot of systems that are these all-in-one systems that do operational tasks in addition to do marketing tasks and all the rest. So we have that classification. It hasn't changed because those are the fundamental things that systems do. They don't change. I mean, how you organize it, the architectures, whether it's one system or components or cloud or not, that stuff changes, but the fundamental business processes don't change. Therefore, our classification scheme hasn't changed.
Now, how does the concept of composable CDP then add on to this? Because I mean, that's orthogonal to this kind of onion principle that you just explained.
Well, the composable CDP just says, okay, again, think of those functionalities and really think of even subsets within that. So within the data functionality, there's the data ingestion, there's, to the extent that you do data cleaning, there's the data extraction, there's the identity management, there's all these different functionalities, and there's about a dozen or so that we've identified just within that. And then there's another set of functionalities related to analytics. Again, there are multiple kinds of analytics. There's data functionalities related to campaign management and to delivery. So you break up those specific functionalities within those broad categories, and the composable CDP or the composability concept says, well, I'm just going to buy different components that do one or the other of those things, or maybe several of those things, and then I'll wire them together in some fashion that's supposed to be very simple and may or may not in reality be so simple. But the theory is it's like, the classic plugging together of Lego blocks, which is a terrible analogy, but it's the one everybody uses. So composable fits into that. It just says, hey, all right, I'm not going to buy one system that does all these things, or maybe not even one system that does one of these things, maybe not even one that does all the data functions, but I'll buy several systems, each of which does a part of the data function. I will integrate them in some fashion or other, and that will give me the functional equivalent of a CDP, of a data CDP, for example. And that's okay. I mean, conceptually, it's easy to describe that and see how it all fits together. So it, again, doesn't pose any like fundamental problem for the way we view the world. It's simply a practical question of, does that make sense for you? Now, in CDP land, as opposed to the larger market where composable has many applications outside of customer data, in the CDP world, a lot of the so-called composable CDPs really were talking about being warehouse centric. Okay. And that was the big difference, was they're not going to build their own database. They're not going to build profiles, which means they don't meet my definition of a CDP, because CDPs build profiles. That's what CDPs do. Remember my 6 categories. So we don't think of them as CDPs, but they can create something that is the functional equivalent of a CDP. And for simplicity and not to be too pedantic, we say, fine, call it a composable CDP, even though literally it doesn't make any sense. And that's okay. I mean, who cares? What's important is always that the users get what the users need. right? And that's the only thing that really matters. The rest of this is important if you're a vendor, but it's not important to the users, and we kind of prefer to prioritize the user's needs over the vendor's needs.
Well, if you want to stay a vendor and not become an ex-vendor, then you probably deliver what the users need.
Oh yeah, no, vendors have a whole different set of issues.
Yeah.
Certainly aware of those.
I mean, you're a consultant too, so and you see probably at many of your clients they have, let's say, part CDPs throughout their IT landscape. So now they want to build this consolidated and ready for activation view on their client base. So how do you consult them to go ahead? When is there a reason to put in a specialized system as opposed to compose one out of existing?
Okay, well, the good news is actually running the CDP Institute's a full-time job, so I don't really do much active consulting anymore, but I certainly advise people and I certainly see what's going on out there. And we certainly think a great deal about helping people to make that choice of, well, composability or traditional integrated CDP. No, we don't really have a term that everybody likes for the classic CDPs. And like any good consultant, we say, hey, it's all about use cases. It's all about what your situation needs. It depends, right? Classic consultant answer. It depends. And for some large amount of money, I will go and I will analyze your situation and I will tell you for what makes sense for you. So what I would do, what I did do when I was a consultant, and what the consultants we work with continue to do, is they do go in, they say, well, all right, what do you have? What's your current status? What do you need? Which really is, what do you want to do and where are the gaps that are preventing you from doing it? And what's the best way to fill those gaps? So if you have a lot of gaps in a lot of areas, it may make sense to buy an integrated CDP and close all those gaps at once. If you only have a few gaps, you have a great data warehouse, you already have identity management in place in your data warehouse, you already have all the data sources that you want, and you're only lacking certain capabilities to, say, extract the data, to share the data out, well, there are composable CDP tools that do reverse ETL that are great at pulling data out. And if that's all you need, there's really no reason to go off and buy a full-blown CDP that's going to do a lot of work that you've already done. So you simply will be replicating that. If, on the other hand, your data warehouse doesn't have customer identities built in, which most don't, if it doesn't have web data coming in, which most don't, if it has a lot of major gaps in that, well, now you have to look, do I want to improve my data warehouse, or is it actually better to just use the data warehouse as one of my sources, take the data warehouse data, which hopefully is great and clean and suitable for purpose, which it may not be because it may have been assembled for some other reason, but if it works for my purpose, great. And then take those other data sources and throw them into a CDP and do things that way. And what the CDP vendors have done in many cases nowadays is they've looked at that and said, well, okay, I will have a hybrid model or something like that that can read that data warehouse data without importing it. Because one of the big concerns or criticisms or arguments in favor of composable, of warehouse centric, is, well, we don't want to copy the data because the data is already assembled. So the CDP vendors say, okay, we'll just read it. We don't need to copy it. We don't need our own copy of it. So long as we can get our hands on it in real time or in whatever format is required to do things that you want us to do. So the CDP vendors have kind of adapted to some extent, but all the big ones now have some sort of a connector that says, if you have a data warehouse, we don't need to copy that data. But if you have other data that you're not assembling, I think website data, then we'll take that and we'll give you a place to put it because it doesn't necessarily fit in your data warehouse. We'll also do a lot of the more advanced processing that, yes, you can do in your data warehouse, but can get very expensive in the data warehouse. The processing within the big cloud data warehouses is a very major cost. It's easy not to see that. And of course, the cloud data warehouses, that's where they make their money. So they're certainly not going to highlight the fact that it's expensive. They're going to actually kind of gloss over that. So again, it comes back to, it depends. You have to look at your situation. You have to look at what you're trying to accomplish. You have to really just say, look, I'm going to analyze both alternatives. I'm going to see what it would take to fix up my data warehouse and make it do everything that I need. I'm going to look at look like if I had a separate CDP that was connected to the data warehouse and do things that way. Let me look at all the costs. Let me look at all the capabilities, make sure I get, say, my real time, which I'm probably not going to get on my data warehouse to begin with, absent some special structures. And let me just see which one works better in terms of cost, in terms of usability, in terms of connections, because the CDP vendors have built all these connections out to the activation systems, which the data warehouse guys may or may not have built. Many of them haven't, but they're getting better at it. So I have to look at the big picture and make sure I understand all the implications of the decisions I'm making, and then hopefully make the right decision.
In the sense of zero copy, which you sort of alluded to as well a moment ago, so how do data graphs fit into that picture?
You have to define data graph.
Well, if I'm looking at SAP, for example, so they are basically creating a network, a semantic network of data elements across different databases or systems that define entities and how they relate to each other. Right. Which basically sounds to me like something that, at least in part, is what a CDP does as well, with a focus on customers. So now, if I see a system landscape that has lots of these different systems that all do part of what a data platform does, and I have anyways the idea of, well, elevating that to include the relationship between the data elements, do you see a possibility to combine that, well, to make that as a kind of, see that as a kind of a super CDP then?
Yeah, and again, it all comes back to it depends if the data graph or data fabric, and those are different things.
Oh, fabric is the other, is the Microsoft term, yeah.
Well, they're actually different things, but I think I couldn't even tell you what the difference is. If it does what you need, great, use it. You know, I mean, again, I don't care. I don't sell anything anyhow. But you know, you as the user, you should again look at what you really require. Does the data graph that you have or can it be made to do what you need? And if that's the most efficient way to do it, terrific. If it's not, the problem with federated data access, which is what we used to call that stuff, is every one of those calls has a cost and it has a time lag associated with it. So can it really assemble the profile in real time? Okay, and what do we mean by real time? To Ralph's earlier thing, is it 30 milliseconds, which is what I need, say, for a bid on an ad network, or is it 2 seconds, which is a reasonably acceptable time for a customer service interaction for something to show up on somebody's screen? Okay, and that's a big difference, 30 milliseconds versus 2 full seconds. So you may be able to do the one and not the other. So it depends on your application. And the problem with defining the applications is there's going to be new applications I don't know about. So you can't be too restrictive and say, well, these are the things I need. If it does this, that's great. Because when you do that, what people tend to do is they tend to start with the simple ones. Says, these are my first 5 use cases, and they're fairly simple. And I'll find a system that does that. But then when you get up to use case 6, which has some other requirement, if your system is very rigid, it may not be able to do that. So you have to look not just at your current use cases or your known use cases, but sort of the flexibility and the power to anticipate other use cases that are also probably going to come up. Now, of course, you can't go too far in that direction, because then you just say, oh, it's got to do everything, be perfect, and then nothing solves that either. So it's a lot of judgment involved. That's what keeps consultants like you guys in business.
We need to stay busy, yeah? Conscious of time. So this hour flew far faster than I feared it fly. So beyond expectations, so to say. We usually stop with the famous last words, which now let's look a little forward. So you coined CDP, you shaped CDP as a definition, as an entity. How do you see CDP look like 5 years from now? What will be the ins? What will be the outs? What will be the indispensable functions that it need to offer? And what will be the unique value that it still adds, plural, no, third person.
Okay, am I supposed to answer that in 1 minute?
Well, you got one more hour.
Okay. On that one point. There are two things, okay? The CDP may evolve to be just a data platform, just a profile building system, which again is really the definition of CDP, in which case it becomes just embedded in other systems. We really see the CDP be embedded in larger systems as the main trend in the marketplace. The other thing, so CDP is a feature, okay, as opposed to a category. The other thing that may happen with CDPs is it becomes really an interface between your core data store, your enterprise data warehouse, for lack of a better description, or your data fabric, if everything's being accessed with zero copy, and your marketing system becomes just the interface layer that takes the large masses of enterprise data and formats it so the different activation systems can use it effectively. I think a lot of the vendors are going to end up sort of in that place as well. And if I'm going to be an independent CDP vendor, that's probably where I'm going to get up. If I'm going to be part of the larger application that simply has a CDP as part of other things, now the CDP is, again, more of a feature. But so those are the two places I could see if I were a CDP vendor, I was going to migrate to one or the other.
Cool. Perfect. Thanks a lot, David. This was beyond amazing. Really beyond amazing. And thanks to Tony for his question. We didn't scare off our attendance unless we ourselves had dozens of sessions open.
That's also possible. But
yeah, so please everybody join in next week as well. So when we are talking about the acceptance of own managed cloud systems as opposed to public cloud systems, and where there is useful AI demand in that section. When we are talking about that with, again, a repeat offender in our show, Christian Knoll. So tune in next week. We are going backstage right now. See you next week then.
Take care.